Walter Grady sat still as stone in the courtroom's second row, his hands folded loosely in his lap. The plastic bench beneath him had no warmth, and the thin county-issued jacket he'd been given did little to shield him from the draft that crept along the floor. His breath formed a faint mist in the stale morning air. He didn't notice. The room was half empty. Municipal courtrooms often were, especially for low-level cases, for people who slipped through cracks too narrow to hold the crowd's attention. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A clock ticked without urgency. A janitor swept outside the chamber doors, the bristles scraping faintly across the linoleum. Walter's eyes, dull from fatigue but alert from decades of training, scanned the room like a soldier checking his perimeter. There was no danger here, just paperwork and apathy, but old habits didn't dissolve easily. Near the back row, a man in a worn denim jacket sat hunched forward, elbows on knees, fingers interlocked tightly. Evan Mills. He hadn't intended to come. He wasn't even sure why he had. He told his job he was sick. He didn't lie often, but he couldn't stomach the thought of Walter sitting alone through what he knew would be nothing more than a formality, processed like meat through a factory line. He remembered Walter's eyes from that morning at the market. The way he hadn't defended himself, hadn't argued, hadn't begged. Just stood there, bread visible in his coat, as if even theft should be dignified. The bailiff called for order, his voice low and mechanical. He tapped a wooden batten on the side of the bench with more ceremony than sincerity. A court clerk recited a docket number. Case 47-293. People of the State of New York versus Walter Edward Grady. The name floated through the air like smoke. Walter stood slowly, a little stiff from the cold. The clink of his dog tags was nearly inaudible, but Evan heard it and sat straighter. The judge's entrance was quick. A tall man with graying temples and a practiced frown. His robe hung heavy, a daily uniform of decisions made quickly. Judge Michael Carmichael had built a reputation over 20 years, efficient, unyielding, precise. He didn't waste time on speeches or sentiment. He reached for the case file on his desk, fingers flipping through the paperwork without interest. Petty theft. Prior incidents. Homeless. No fixed address. Standard. Then he paused. His thumb stopped at the front page. Walter Edward Grady. He read it again. He looked up. Walter stood at the defendant's podium with his shoulders square and his head lowered slightly, not in shame, but in the same way a man might bow during a moment of silence. Not apologetic. Not defeated. Just respectful. The judge stared at him. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Carmichael's hand moved slowly to lift the next page, a photocopy of an ID. Grainy, worn. Beneath the laminate, the face was unmistakable. His eyes widened just slightly. He flipped again. A note from the arresting officer, subject claimed to be a veteran. Dog tags confirmed. Prior shoplifting charges. No known residence. Another page. Prior service, United States Army. Rank, Staff Sergeant. Discharged honorably. Years served, 22. Last deployment, Afghanistan. And then one more. A commendation citation, attached as evidence of character. The Bronze Star. Saved 17 men by driving a burning supply truck away from the convoy during an ambush outside Fallujah. The official language was stiff, but the words rang clear. Sergeant Grady disregarded personal injury and enemy fire to secure the lives of fellow soldiers. The judge's hand stopped moving. His mouth twitched. He looked up again. It wasn't just the record. It wasn't the citation. It was the name. And the face. He reached down to the drawer beneath the bench and opened it slowly. From within, he drew a thin photo frame, old, unpolished. He kept it there always. A habit. A reminder. Inside was a faded photograph of a unit standing in front of a tent, laughing in desert heat, rifles slung lazily, arms thrown around shoulders. He found himself in the photo immediately, Private First Class Michael Carmichael. 2 rows back, helmet tilted, youth in his eyes. And there, behind him, slightly off-center, stood a taller man with a solemn expression. Square jaw, deep-set eyes. Uniform tight. That same calm posture. Walter Grady. His breath caught. He remembered. It had been a chaotic night, the kind that blurred over time except for the moments that refused to fade. The evacuation. The roadside explosion. The fire in the supply truck. He had been unconscious for part of it, dragged, he later learned, for 2 miles over sand and rubble by a man who refused to abandon his post until every last soldier had been lifted from the field. His commanding officer had called it stubbornness. Walter had called it duty. The judge rose suddenly. No one in the room understood why. No protocol called for it. No precedent demanded it. But something inside Carmichael told him that this man didn't deserve to be looked down on from behind a bench. Not today. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. The clerk stopped typing. The bailiff stood straighter. Walter raised his head slightly, confusion flickering behind his eyes. His expression didn't change, but Evan could tell he noticed the judge's silence. The recognition in it. Judge Carmichael placed the photo frame gently on the bench and cleared his throat. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he said. His voice was different. Not rough or cold, but subdued. Stunned. The gavel did not slam. It rested quietly beside his hand. Then he stepped away from the bench, his robe swaying with quiet urgency, and disappeared behind the chamber door without explanation. Evan remained motionless in the back row, the weight of something unspoken pressing against his chest. Walter lowered his head again. No reaction. No questions. Just stillness. As if silence said more than any words could. The courtroom remained still long after the judge disappeared. No announcements. No explanations. Just a tension that hung in the air like a held breath. The clerk shuffled papers with unnecessary care. The bailiff leaned on the far wall, glancing occasionally toward the chamber door, as if trying to read a silent script the rest of them weren't given. Walter sat quietly at the defendant's podium, unmoving. Evan Mills shifted in his seat. He felt the weight of the moment without knowing its shape. He didn't know what the judge had seen, what he had remembered, but he could sense something had changed. There was a difference in the way the clerk looked at Walter now. Less dismissive. More reverent. 15 minutes passed. Then 5 more. Finally, the chamber door opened. Judge Carmichael stepped back into the courtroom slowly, without his robe. His suit beneath it was plain, modest. Civilian. He approached the bench not as an authority, but as a man. He carried a folder in one hand and a thin piece of paper in the other. His face was unreadable. He took his seat again and adjusted the microphone, but he didn't speak into it. Instead, he looked directly at Walter. And for a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he opened the folder and placed the contents face down on the bench. He tapped the top of the microphone. His voice, when it came, was clear, but measured. "The court has reviewed the defendant's record and circumstances," he said, not reading from the sheet, but from memory. "I have considered the facts of the case, the prior history, and the full context surrounding the alleged theft." He looked out across the room, not meeting any specific eyes. "There are times," he continued, "when justice is not found in statutes, but in memory." A soft murmur rippled in the gallery. The judge leaned forward, elbows resting gently on the bench. "Mr. Grady," he said, now looking directly at Walter, "you are hereby released on your own recognizance. Charges dismissed." The courtroom held still, as if the walls themselves had stopped breathing. Walter didn't move. He blinked once. Then twice. No words. Just a slow, steady nod, as if acknowledging not just the decision, but something deeper. A recognition that had taken years and a chance arrest to finally arrive. Judge Carmichael stood again. This time, so did the bailiff. And then something extraordinary happened. The clerk rose to her feet. One by one, so did everyone in the courtroom. Not from instruction. Not from tradition. But because something ancient and decent had stirred in that room, a respect long buried beneath bureaucracy and routine. Evan Mills found himself standing, too, heart hammering in his chest. Walter, still silent, turned and walked back down the aisle. No handcuffs. No officer at his side. Just the quiet scuff of his boots on the linoleum. As he passed Evan, he paused, not long, just enough to look him in the eye. A moment passed between them, unspoken but weighty. Then Walter stepped out of the courtroom and into the winter light. Later that day, the story began to spread. Not because Walter told it, he didn't. Not because the judge explained himself, he wouldn't. But because one of the interns, a second-year law student sitting in the back of the room, had written a short post online. A veteran stole a loaf of bread today because he hadn't eaten in 3 days. A judge stood when he saw the man who once carried him to safety through fire. I saw justice today. And it didn't come from a gavel, it came from memory. The post went viral within hours. Walter's face wasn't in it. Nor the judge's name. But the story spread like sunlight through fog. People began to ask questions. A local reporter found a decades-old military report with the name Grady mentioned more than once. Others followed the trail to an old VA registry. A Bronze Star recipient. 3 tours. 1 act of heroism buried by time. By the end of the week, the staff at the VA hospital in Brooklyn had received more calls than they could handle. Veterans asking about Walter. Journalists requesting interviews. Politicians offering press statements. None of it mattered to Walter. He had disappeared again, into the quiet corners of the city he had learned to survive in. But others noticed. The manager of Morelli's Market placed a note in the front window the next morning. It read simply, "In honor of Walter Grady, a quiet protector. Any veteran in need eats free." The judge never spoke publicly about the case. But a month later, a new photograph appeared on the wall of his office, next to the old one of the Desert Unit. It showed a courtroom, half full, all standing. Walter's name was never mentioned. But his shadow was there, in the empty courtroom chair, in the folded hands of the next defendant, in the long silence before every ruling that followed. Somewhere beneath the noise of daily life, a man had carried the weight of 17 lives through fire, and then, for years, the weight of his own silence. Now, someone else carried part of it. And even if no one could see it, Evan Mills knew. Something had shifted. A town had remembered. Walter didn't return to the courtroom. He didn't return to the bench outside Morelli's Market or the alley behind the recycling depot where he used to sleep. For a few days, it was as though the city had swallowed him whole again, just as it had for the past 15 years. But the city had changed in subtle ways. On the sidewalk outside the market, someone had placed a small thermos on the bench where Walter used to sit. Every morning, it was filled with hot coffee. No name. No note. Just always there, steaming gently in the dawn chill. The old man from the barbershop down the street began sweeping the alley more thoroughly. He said it was for sanitation, but each night he also left behind a clean blanket folded beside the doorway. It was never discussed. One morning, a laminated card appeared on the corkboard inside Morelli's, a photograph of a young man in desert fatigues, standing beside a military vehicle. Beneath it, a quote in black marker, "You never leave your own behind." No one claimed credit for putting it there. But the manager didn't take it down. At a subway entrance near Fulton Street, a street artist painted a small mural, a pair of worn boots, a backpack, and a dog tag chain looped across both. It was tucked discreetly into a pillar, where it could be overlooked by most, but not by those who had seen enough to recognize it. Evan Mills noticed them all. He had returned to work, back to his wires and circuit panels, his quiet hours and calloused hands. But something had shifted in him. He no longer rushed past those slumped-in doorways. He paused. Sometimes he asked names. Sometimes he simply nodded. At night, he found himself thinking about Walter, not just as a veteran, not just as a man who once carried others through war, but as a man who had been forgotten and still chose not to scream about it. That choice, Evan realized, was the loudest thing of all. A week after the courtroom hearing, a letter arrived at the judge's office. It bore no return address, but the handwriting was precise, the paper crisp. Inside was a single photograph, an old black and white image of a woman standing in front of a garden, holding a basket of bread. Written on the back, "She taught me that feeding someone isn't charity. It's survival. W.G." Judge Carmichael kept that photo on his desk after that, beside the two already there. His clerks noticed, but none ever asked about it. Meanwhile, small tremors of the story kept rippling outward. A community board in the Bronx passed a motion to install lockers outside community centers for veterans without shelter. A bakery in Queens began offering free day-old bread to anyone who asked, no questions. A radio host mentioned the courtroom story in passing, and dozens of callers phoned in to say they remembered someone like Walter. Each story different. Each story the same. But not all the voices were kind. Some accused the court of overreach. Said it set a dangerous precedent, letting a thief walk because of nostalgia. Everyone has a sob story, one editorial read. We cannot let sentiment erode structure. The judge never responded. But that morning, Evan found himself standing outside Morelli's again. It had snowed overnight. He had the day off. He wasn't sure why he'd come. Then he saw him. Walter. He stood beneath the awning, brushing snow off his shoulders, the same military pack slung over one arm. His beard had been trimmed. His coat was cleaner, though still old. He looked thinner, but sharper. Alert. Present. He nodded at Evan. And Evan, without words, stepped forward and handed him a fresh cup of coffee from the shop next door. Walter took it without hesitation. Not with the shame of a man taking charity, but the simplicity of a man accepting something he'd earned 100 times over. They stood like that for a few minutes, watching the snow fall. No words. Just breath and snow and warmth held between paper cups. Eventually, Walter nodded once more, turned, and walked up the street, disappearing around a corner. That afternoon, Evan returned home and opened the envelope that had arrived in his mailbox. No return address. Inside, a war coin. It was smooth, slightly worn, with the insignia of a unit Evan had never served with, but recognized all the same. He turned it over. Etched into the back, to the man who stood. Evan placed it in his tool drawer, beneath a small cloth, beside a set of wire cutters he'd owned since his apprenticeship. He never spoke of it. But every so often, he would reach for it, not for memory, but for courage. Winter passed, slowly and without drama. Snow melted into gutters, city buses resumed their regular clatter, and New Yorkers returned to their rhythm of rushing past one another with practiced indifference. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just persistently. In the months that followed, the story of Walter Grady receded from the headlines, but not from memory. It had settled into the quiet corners of the city, etched not in marble or monument, but in action. Outside Morelli's, the bench remained. A new plaque had been fastened to it, small and unobtrusive, just a strip of bronze. For those who carried more than we ever knew. Every morning, someone different sat there. An older man in a Marine cap. A woman in a Navy parka with trembling hands. A teenager with a military bracelet around his wrist who just needed a place to think. Sometimes they nodded at one another. Sometimes they sat in silence. The bench had become something more than wood and steel. Across the boroughs, change took root without announcement. The city transit system implemented a quiet program, veterans who presented proof of service rode free on Mondays and Fridays. It wasn't publicized. No posters. Just a line added to the digital fare system. Riders found out through word of mouth, and conductors started to nod more respectfully to those who showed dog tags instead of tickets. Local diners began keeping extra plates on hand, meals paid for by strangers, always labeled in case someone's hungry. Waitresses began leaving out thermoses of soup during colder nights. No one asked questions. No one kept tabs. At one community college, a sociology professor changed her syllabus to include a new case study, When Dignity Returns to the Forgotten. The assignment, write about one person who changed the system not with protest, but presence. On a rainy afternoon in late spring, Evan Mills walked into a vocational school he'd once applied to and never attended. He didn't carry a resume. He didn't bring credentials. Just an idea. He proposed a night class, Basic Electrical SK*LLS for veterans and the unhoused. Free. No ID required. No paperwork. Just show up, and he'd teach them what he knew: wiring, fuses, circuits, safety. It took 3 weeks to get approved. The first night, only 2 men showed up. One of them didn't even take notes, just listened, nodding slowly. The second class, 4 people came. By the 3rd month, the classroom was full. They didn't talk about Walter. Evan never brought him up. But on the whiteboard, in small handwriting near the corner, he'd written a phrase no one erased. Kindness without question is enough. Judge Carmichael retired that summer. No press conference. No farewell ceremony. He declined all interviews. But in his final ruling before stepping down, he dismissed a series of minor theft charges brought against a group of homeless veterans who had been caught breaking curfew in a city park. He cited their military records, their mental health history. But more than that, he cited the duty of a just society to remember what it owes. It was the only time in 25 years he'd added a personal remark to a decision. The law journals barely noticed. But the legal clerk who typed up the ruling wept quietly at her desk when she read it. As for Walter, he was never seen in that courtroom again. Some said they spotted him once, on the Upper West Side, speaking to a group of high school students gathered outside the Museum of Natural History. Others claimed he'd moved north, maybe into the Adirondacks. A few believed he died quietly one night, beneath a blanket with his boots beside him. No one knew for certain. But every Veterans Day, a folded flag appeared on the bench outside Morelli's. Tucked inside, a single dog tag. No one ever saw who placed it there. And Evan? He kept teaching. Kept walking the same routes. And every so often, when no one was looking, he would reach into his pocket and brush his thumb across the smooth edge of that coin, the one he kept wrapped in cloth beside his wire cutters. Not for luck. Not for memory. But to remind himself that one small action, made without spectacle or reward, could tilt the course of things. He never saw himself as a hero. Never accepted invitations to speak. But sometimes, at night, when he passed the plaque on the bench, he would pause, tip his head, and walk on without a word. Because he understood now. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it stands quietly. And waits to be remembered.